that's a really big part of being a founder is like you have to be the spirit of the team and the spirit of the company.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Clean Techies podcast, where we interview ClimateTech founders and VCs to discuss all things building and investing to solve the biggest challenge of our generation, climate change. Today, we have a fun conversation with Julie Kring, the founder and CEO of Khepra, which featuring some loud clanging noises from my downstairs neighbor. We had somebody doing construction right in the middle of recording, but hopefully it's not too bad for you as you're listening. Khepra is using wood waste products such as sawdust to create agrochemical alternatives to the harmful conventional chemicals used on farmers' fields, for example. And there was a lot of really, really interesting things that we covered today. I think that the main things to talk about and what the conversation covers are the origin story of the company and a little bit about her background and how she in particular ended up doing something like this. A lot about the process of going through R&D, an R&D technology kind of process all the way through to commercialization or industrialization, and quite a lot of advice for other founders going through that process or building a company in that space. And she told us about her experience raising money and offered a lot of insights on doing that with a company like Khepra as well. I thought there's some pretty good nuggets there, I think. So if you're going through that process right now, you're short for time, I'd recommend skipping towards that. That's probably around halfway through. And then we wrapped up with a bit more about mindset and kind of parts around how to keep your team dynamic strong. She offered some pretty interesting insights there that we don't really hear quite often. So I thought this was awesome. Overall, really impactful conversation. I quite enjoyed it very much so, and I'm looking forward to hopefully speaking with her again in the future as they continue to grow. So with that, enjoy the episode. All right, welcome to the show, Julie. How are you doing today?
I am doing very well. How are you?
I cannot complain. It's been some beautiful weather in New York for the past couple weeks. It's been busy for me, but I can't complain at all. Where are you calling from exactly?
I'm in Alabama, actually.
Oh, very nice. Is that where you are for kind of the long period, or is that just a short-term visit?
So I live here. I'm originally from California, born and raised, and yeah, I've just found some really interesting opportunities out here.
Very nice. I don't think I've ever had. I don't really know many people who are in Alabama or from Alabama, so that's an interesting topic to start off with. But I guess let's just get a quick intro to yourself, if you want to give us a little bit of background on you and kind of what you're doing today and how did you get into climate?
Yeah, well, I'm a biochemist. I've always been fascinated by biomaterials. I was completely captured by the rise and fall of biofuel about 10 years ago, and that's really what inspired Khepra, actually. Um, yeah, I moved to Alabama actually because it is a very large exporter of chemicals and there's a lot of biomass here. So it's a very neat and tidy way to follow my passion.
So I there's something that's it's kind of interesting that you followed that and that's how you got started. But I'm curious about something that I saw when I was doing a bit of research on the website, which was it says you were raised by a serial entrepreneur, if I understood correctly. I was just kind of curious if you could talk more about your upbringing and how that kind of influenced you on becoming an entrepreneur or not. I'm kind of curious to understand if it was really intentional from your upbringing or if it was really just something that kind of came to be as a byproduct kind of accidentally.
Yeah, that's a great question. So my dad, he grew up in rural Nevada in extreme poverty and he's 16, moved out of his house and became a contractor, building houses, that kind of thing, dealing poker. He was a mountaineer and he woke up one day and he realized that he wanted something bigger for himself. So he went to community college and then later went on and got a PhD in electrical engineering and computer science at UC Berkeley. From there, I think he commercialized his PhD research in electrical engineering, started a company and sold it. It's funny, I almost was a trust fund baby. He was a VP of engineering at an IT company right around the sort of Y2K era. Um, the original .com bubble crash, as well as the reason why I'm not a trust fund baby. Although I have definitely been very privileged and very lucky in my life. But he has, ever since I was a child, jumped around through a series of really interesting technologies. So he was involved in developing fiber optic sensors for medical devices. He did IoT. He was involved in machine learning. And what my dad really did for me in my upbringing was he gave me a really deep connection to the Sierra Nevada. Basically, every break that we had, we'd go out camping. He taught me how to be a mountaineer. He showed me what it was like actually up in the Alpine Sierras. And, that really made a huge impression on me, turned me into an environmentalist. But the other tool that he gave me in my upbringing is the understanding of how technology can solve problems. I originally thought I was going to get into politics, but there was a time in my life that was very formative when I was participating in a political campaign, and I saw how PAC money was really muddying the waters of democracy, frankly. And that made me deeply upset. And he pointed me originally to the biofuel companies, and he made a point to show how these companies were changing the whole model for energy at the time. And that was really, really promising to me.
Hey there. Quick break to remind any founders or VCs listening, if you are looking for deal flow, seeking to raise funding, looking for partners to help service your needs, or perhaps you're looking for corporate investment partners, feel free to reach out to us through our Slack channel, which can be found in the description. Because we meet a lot of people in this space, we set aside time each week to make introductions to the various people that we encounter. This is something we do free of charge in order to help these incredible companies solving climate change to scale. Looking forward to hearing from you in the Slack channel. Yeah, that's pretty fascinating. I think it's oftentimes underestimated. At least I don't know. It's not very often that people who come on the show talk about necessarily how their parents per se were, I guess, the reason why they ended up the way they are. I think it's difficult to sometimes give the credit away. But I do appreciate that. It's pretty interesting and fascinating background. So I'd like to move forward from there. Is once you kind of got interested in the biofuel space, how did you end up going on to start Khepra?
Yeah, well, in college, I was interested in pursuing projects in that field. A group of students and I got together and we built what's called a phototubular bioreactor, which is basically a tube where you grow algae. We collected the algae from that, and I was kind of fixated on this concept that I would call using the whole buffalo. It's kind of like when indigenous people hunted buffalo, they used the hides and the bones and the meat, and they didn't let anything go to waste. So we took that algae and we broke it up into its key constituent macromolecules, so the cellulose, the proteins, and the lipids. And we found a chemical process for each of those things to turn it into a value-added material. And through that project is actually how I learned about ultrasound and using ultrasound in chemistry. And I was doomed from that moment on. That's what became Khepra eventually.
That's pretty interesting. I'm not an engineer by training or anything. I find it fascinating, all these different challenges. That's probably part of the reason I'm podcasting. I get to talk to smart people, but I am kind of curious to know, maybe just like without getting too far into it, if you can give me kind of like a bit of a crash course on how does it work when you do something like that, right? So you mentioned that you're taking something, you're trying to look at the individual molecules and see what can these be used for to use everything. Can you talk us through that a little bit, just as like a rough kind of intro on that?
Yeah. So first principles, when you make a chemical, you're using heat and pressure in order to create that chemical. That's the energy source for converting one thing to another. And in a chemical process, it's a bit like making soup, where you have a recipe, you add different components, and on the output, you have something completely new, complex, and with functionality. So take cellulose, for example. Lots of people have looked at cellulose as a raw material for bioplastic. And in that project, what we did was we actually found an original process for making cellulose into bioplastic, where you take it and you modify it with a functional group. And when you do that, This plastic's actually been around. I think it was the original plastic, cellulosic acetate. They use it in glasses. They use it in films. Um, there's all these different applications, and it comes from this basic raw material that's been modified to have greater purpose.
Hmm. Okay, so you're basically just looking at something that's lying around, and you just kind of figure out how can it be used, and you put things together to create it. So what I'd like to do then from this point, if I've got that right, is can you explain kind of what exactly the company does at very, very high level? And then let's break it down into the components of, what raw materials are you taking and what's it becoming and what's that process look like? Just so it's very, very simple and people can understand very clearly what you do.
Yeah, yeah. So what we've done at Khepra is we've designed a chemical reactor. And typical chemical reactors burn hydrocarbons, so natural gas, to create heat and pressure. And that's what's used in the chemicals industry to turn crude oil into plastic or fuel. Even pharmaceuticals are manufactured this way. So we have a novel technology for being able to create that heat and pressure, which is ultrasound, specifically high intensity focused ultrasound, which is basically just focusing sound like light in a magnifying glass. And that can create these really, really hot spots within the reactor in order to cause chemical reactions to occur. What we've looked at has actually been all over the board. We've turned plastics back into fuels. We've been able to crack nitrogen, which is a notoriously hard and energy intensive thing to do. But what we're focused on is converting sawdust into value added materials. So basically, we take raw sawdust, which is lignin and cellulose. We split it up into those two key parts, and then we modify them with sort of simple ingredients in order for them to have novel functionality. So we're focused on agriculture as a market, particularly because agriculture is very cost constrained, as well as there's not a huge amount of competition actually, um, as compared to other types of materials out there, largely due to the fact that you have to be able to be cost competitive with petroleum derived chemicals.
Hey there. Are you building a climate tech business and looking for very specialized talent? Consider reaching out to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change yourself, feel free to reach out to NextWave at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. Hmm. So when you say there's not competition, you're saying there's not necessarily a lot of competition in the clean version of the fuels or the clean version of the application?
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah, farmers, they just simply cannot pay a green premium,
Mm-hmm.
whereas
Mm-hmm.
take, personal care or bioplastic, that sort of thing. It's a bit
Mm-hmm.
easier to ask the consumer to pay more
Mm-hmm.
if they care for a much more sustainable product.
Okay. Interesting. So I guess then this is pretty fascinating to me. I don't know if you know this or not from listening to the other parts of the show, but I grew up with my dad as a carpenter, so we had plenty of sawdust around that we were always disposing of from his shop. So I'm kind of curious, like how does it work? You take the sawdust. Do you have a commercial model or a pilot for this yet at this point? On where are you getting this? What's the application for, and how does it work, and how does it benefit the people who have that waste product, right? Something like sawdust, for example.
Yeah, so we work with lumber mills and people who make products out of wood. So we're also working with a pallet company. And yeah, like your dad, every time they cut the wood, there is this fine particulate matter that is just kind of ends up on the ground. Sometimes they can sell it for really low value things like animal bedding, or sometimes it's pelletized and sold as fuel. But that doesn't really generate a lot of revenue for the mills. It basically is just a break even on their cost to ship it around. What we can do for them is provide additional revenue streams that are profit positive for them, while also creating sustainable biomaterials for the end user. So typically agrochemical companies or farmers themselves.
Okay, got it. And then I guess out of curiosity, I don't know if you've been able to study this or not yet, but what are the benefits to, let's use the example of agriculture. What are the benefits to them using this material, this application instead of the conventional? Is there, aside from them just doing it in a green way, are there benefits that are kind of you're exploring right now or you're seeing kind of the beginnings of?
Yeah, yeah. So there's something that actually keeps me up at night. A lot of the chemicals used in agriculture are largely detrimental to human health as well. And so when you spray a chemical out over a field, it doesn't just stay in the field. It ends up in water, for example, and then we drink the water, and then those chemicals end up in our bodies. And so take some common agricultural surfactants. They're what's called an endocrine disruptor, which means that they mess with your hormones. They can impede, development, physical development of, children. And generationally, those effects do compound as well. So, maybe you don't get cancer right away from consuming these things, but year after year, there's compounding effects.
Interesting. Is that like a pretty widely understood and known fact that is just it's not like it's a quote unquote conspiracy. People understand it and it's still being just let being done. Like I come from a pretty rural part of the country where nobody trusts anything, right? So I just kind of curious, like what is the understanding there and why is that allowed to go on at all in the meantime?
Yeah, so particularly with the surfactant that I mentioned, the EPA has very public information about how they've limited its use, and that it is impactful to human health. The EU has banned certain surfactants, and there's definitely a lot of talk about glyphosate, which is a common herbicide, Roundup. But I think that that's kind of a model for what uh, is kind of going on in agrochemical systems where the companies really don't want to get rid of the things that they're using, just because the supply chains are established and it's very hard to make switches when you're that big of a company. But there is also, a lot of widely spread knowledge and held up by reputable institutions that say that these things are very, very detrimental.
hmm Yeah, I mean, I personally am somebody who would lean towards that camp of we need to get rid of these things. I'm very big on these items, but I guess it's kind of interesting to think about that. I think there's one time, this is a long time ago. I spoke with somebody from Breakthrough Energy Ventures who was very basically they said that they don't look at anything that's non-industrial farming, right? And they're kind of in on that idea because of the fact that it's scalable, right, or whatnot. And I think that there's a lot of people who want this. It's easy to have a bigger farm and manage it like a business than it is to have a lot of small farms and manage a complex supply chain. And I come from a
Hmm.
family of many people in my family were or are farmers in small, small like 30 to 70 person or 70 cow, milking farms, for example. And it's a kind of a lifestyle that like they like to have. And it would be interesting to see if there's a way that through proving out these kind of the detriments of these things that we can actually come back to a little bit of a different and more diversified supply chain for people where maybe we're not shipping everything across the country to feed everybody and it's more localized. I don't think that's the topic of today, but I would be keen maybe to catch you offline about that at some point. Um, the thing I would like to, and I think this could be very valuable for people who have a similar type of study focus as you did. Maybe people who are very interested in climate tech right now, studying the sciences. Can you talk about I guess, the business process in some ways of going from hey, I'm looking around, I'm just researching, I'm figuring out what is going on here, and then taking an idea and knowing when is this something that I should run with, and then figuring out okay, how do I go and commercialize this? Can you walk us through that process, kind of from R&D through to commercialization, in what your experience has been and what you've learned from that? Hey there. Are you building a climate tech business and looking for very specialized talent? Consider reaching out to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change yourself, feel free to reach out to NextWave at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page.
Yeah. And it's a lot easier to say in retrospect. And I certainly made a lot of mistakes along the way. But the two things that, say, a procurement person at a chemicals company is looking for is cost and performance. So they need to see equivalent or better performance of the product you're putting in front of them. And the cost is a no-brainer if you're operating at a 10 to 15% discount relative to what they're using now. It is hard for big companies to make a switch if there's supply chain risk. So that's why they tend to be very entrenched is if you're a bear and you're operating on the order of hundreds of thousands of tons and you have a single supplier for a novel bio-based chemical, then that's a huge risk to you. So you have to be able to work alongside these companies and build trust as well as, speak their language, frankly. And one thing that I wish I could have told a young Julie is build to a specific market. So say we've made a couple of pivots along the way. We started out converting plastics to fuels, and then we found we have this surfactant that we're currently working on. And we thought we'd put it in personal care, but then that it didn't make sense, and we went to agriculture. Um, and so it's really easy to build a solution when you really understand the problem and you're problem focused, which is kind of a platitude I'm sure lots of entrepreneurs have heard, but specificity to a certain market does make the job quite a bit easier. And understanding who is the right customer for you right now, and how does that relate to customers that you could work with in the long run is really, really huge. So working with a medium-sized company is way easier for a startup than trying to get caught up in sort of the wheels of bureaucracy at a major corporation. Um, so for surfactants, as an example, we're working with other startups as well as medium-sized companies on novel formulations using our surfactant, and that can easily carry over from data collection standpoint and a performance standpoint into a larger company like a Bayer.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's interesting. So I guess with you mentioned that it's better to build to a specific end in mind, but I guess the question I have is like, is that really possible when you're kind of just I don't know what it's like, so maybe I'm using incorrect terminology, but I would say, kind of playing around in a lab trying to find a use case for something. How can you exactly build towards an end without knowing the limits of the chemistry or whatnot? Like how does that work? Is there a way you could have done that differently?
Yeah. I can see how I set that up almost like a chicken and an egg type
Yeah.
situation, but I would say that what ultimately guided me towards where I am today is being founded on core principles. So yeah, industry decarbonization, whether it's fuels or agriculture, has been a really key part of my core values. And having a fundamental technology that is essentially a platform technology has been really helpful. It does give us the opportunity to pivot into different things. And it did also give us the flexibility to be able to do that customer discovery and discover the market that made the most sense for us. So yeah, definitely operate from a place of passion. And in particular, if like say you're a biochemist and you know about a chemical that is really, really nasty, then that's a great place to start. That's definitely a great place to start is figuring out how to take out this one chemical from the supply chain.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess I think it's interesting. The whole idea of R&D is to me a bit fascinating because you have, I would imagine, I mean, you can correct me if I have some of these assumptions wrong, but I would imagine in a research setting, you've got a lot of people kind of, uh, something my dad would say, putzing around, like kind of figuring things out, working with things, and just kind of exploring. But many times, especially if these are more junior people, right? Like if they're just fresh graduates, they have an idea of how things work. They may not necessarily know what they're looking at. And unless there's somebody more senior who understands, oh, wow, like that's crazy. That's actually quote unquote a breakthrough. That's something that has legs, if you will, right? Like an
Mm-hmm.
experienced entrepreneur would be able to point out a good idea versus a budding entrepreneur who thinks every idea is good, but most of them are trash, right? And
Mhm.
then the second problem to me is, okay, once you have that expert who is clearly only an expert in that chemistry or whatever, because they've spent so much time doing that, they're probably not necessarily an expert in industries, right? So they may actually not know how to apply something to the commercial world. So, do you, in your experience, have you seen this, or do you have any thoughts on how it could be done better in the future of pairing kind of the, I don't know if you call it the academic research world with the commercial world in some way, where there's, a forum of people from a particular industry who say, hey, we have people here who understand the problems we face, and they have a basic understanding of chemistry or whatnot. We're going to go send them to kind of watch what you guys are doing in these labs and figure out, hey, is there something here that could be valuable? Is there anything that you've experienced there? And if not, how could it be done better?
Yeah, yeah. What comes to mind is the importance of team. And each component of a team is invaluable. So, to your point, having that young person who is really passionate and has a vision, that is just as important as the long-standing advisory scientist who knows what does and doesn't work. And then on the business side as well, it's important to have people who are experienced in finance, experienced in business development, because there are a lot of roadblocks like regulatory risk and building financial models for a chemicals company is not the same as building a financial model for an app. Um, it's very complicated, and from experience, I tried to build a financial projection. It was terrible, and then my CFO did it, and it was wonderful, and it worked really well. And that just comes from his long career in doing those things. So very much respect to every component of my team, and I'd say that that's an important thing to value. Um, yeah, and so, I think whether you're a young person in industry or a young person working in a lab, having a good finger on the pulse of what an industry where its pain points are, which you can look that up in ESG calls, for example, or even on websites. Like Bayer is very public about their intention to move towards bio-derived and safe chemicals in their products. Um, and so it takes a lot of reading for sure, and it takes a lot of investigative work. But that's where the young person, the sort of blue flame on the team, can really shine. Is just relentlessly looking for that application that has a lot of value to the end customer.
hmm Yeah, that's interesting. I guess to maybe go back slightly on something you were talking about on your experience here, if you were to go back and do it again, if somebody else is listening who's got this, they figured out something that's pretty fascinating, but they're just kind of looking around for a solution. Do you have advice for them on what steps to take to, or what people to speak with to go and then, find kind of fill in the gaps of your own knowledge when it comes to industry or whatnot? Do you have any advice to people in that circumstance where they have something, but they just need to kind of get a compass, if you will, of where to head?
Yeah, yeah. I would say uh, what can be really valuable is talk to the corporate venture arm of the company that you're looking to target, because they generally have a very good understanding of the company's mandates and what technologies the companies are looking for. So, for example, during my time doing plastics to fuels, I did talk to somebody at the BP group, the venture arm, and he said, "Yeah, plastics to fuels is great, but come back." Oh, my phone just fell. Come back to me when you can show a path to producing 20 million gallons of fuel per year. And that was a really interesting indicator of what direction we should go with this technology, with the funding sources that were available, and what kind of capital expenditure it would take for us to get to a meaningful place of commerciality. And then on the flip side, there are other corporate venture arms that we've talked to that are looking at companies that are much earlier stage. Um, Groups like Yara and Nutrien are looking at very bleeding edge technologies in ammonia and green ammonia. So it does kind of take finding the true north and finding the right industry and community of people to really have a good fit for you and your startup in the stage of your technology, to be able to start bringing on investment and interest and kind of grinding away until you can eventually get to that, large scale processing.
Hmm. Yeah, that's pretty fascinating. I think that's a great answer. That's really interesting to hear. That does lead into my next questions, which is around funding for something like this. So, could you talk us through the process of, okay, how'd you get started, in terms of like the finances, right? How did you afford to get going on an idea? Because I'm assuming you maybe had a theory or something, and then you kind of began poking around to see if it worked, and then from there you have a bit of technology and you're working towards commercializing it, and then you might be able to raise. But could you walk us through that process of how you do it, and if other people are kind of in the same shoes as you were, 5 years ago or so, how would they go through that process, and how did you go through the funding process?
Yeah, yeah. So, the early days of Khepra were super, super scrappy. We had a $400 ultrasonic welding transducer that we bought off Amazon, and we put it in a little beaker full of corn oil. And we cooked the corn oil, and we made this black sludge. Um, and then around that time, I decided, oh, I think I'm out of college. I need to go get a job. And I interviewed at a few places, and I had two offers. One was at an immunotherapies company, and the other was at this like wackadoo technology firm in South San Francisco that was just like this warehouse. And from wall to wall, there were these insane machines that these people had created. And I saw an opportunity there where I took the job at the immunotherapies company, and then I brokered with the technology firm to do some contracting work in exchange for using their analytical equipment. So we got our first results, analytical results on that corn oil to show that we had like chopped it up a little bit, basically, um, through that deal that we made. And then we took that data and we went to IndieBio. And at the time, we had this maybe 20-page long white paper on using ultrasound and the heat and pressure generated by ultrasound in order to make fuels. Um, and that white paper and that GCMS result was enough for IndieBio to accept us into their 2020 accelerator class. And so that was the first money in. It was $200,000. And we used that money to build bigger, more powerful benchtop scale reactors, generated more data. We established ourselves. We were able to find university partners in order to both validate our technology and help us scale it and optimize it. And it was really just a bunch of little baby steps to getting to a point where we really had something. And we had the university backing to show that it was real. And from there, from the benchtop scale, you have to make these models showing how it'll look in a plant and do economic feasibility studies. And so, we paid contractors and consultants to do stuff like that. And once we got the green light from those studies, we were able to raise a little bit more money and a little bit more money, till eventually now we're essentially pre-pilot. We're ready to go. We're about to be, not only commercially active, but profit positive.
Interesting. So that's pretty cool. I like that. I want to ask a couple questions around this. So it sounds as though, which is actually super surprising to me. I thought it would have been different than this, but it sounds as though there actually wasn't a whole lot of grant funding involved. Is this correct?
No, I actually got burned by a couple of like sort of contract grant writing agencies. And writing a grant is really difficult if you don't have a lot of experience in doing that. So great path forward for somebody who's a postdoc, or if you're a professor who's looking to start a company, or a master's student, you've already written grants before. But the language and the format and things like that can be super specific. And if you get it wrong, then you've basically burned up 2 weeks of your own time, or money if you're going through a grant writing agency. So
Hmm.
yeah, a lot of this has just been small checks coming in to meet further and further milestones. to prove the
Hmm.
technology out.
Interesting. So on in terms of the milestones, you mentioned it sounded like there's quite a number of minor funding stages. What is a typical, I guess, time period if there was a typical one, or maybe walk us through a few from one check to okay, we got to meet this next objective, and then we can get another check. What is that typically in this circumstance? And if you're able to, could you compare that to maybe more conventional like software company or something that's like common?
Yeah, yeah. So if you kind of net it all out, we raised about $200,000 year after year to help us meet kind of the next stage and the next stage, um, which is kind of a little bit like what it would be like in grad school. You get a little grant, you get a little grant. Um, it is definitely different from software, where with software, you can kind of start with a wireframe or an MVP that works and you can take on users and show that there's traction there. And that can help you raise millions of dollars in order to essentially acquire more customers and steadily improve the product over time. But there is no like build it in the air rough MVP for chemicals. That is definitely a completely different way of doing starting a company, because frankly you can't sell chemicals until they are essentially perfect, and they've passed regulatory hurdles, and to really start making significant revenue you have to build a facility or you have to contract out to a contract manufacturer. So getting to a point where you're even like pre-revenue, but you have customers can take a really long time and a lot more money than a software company. But of course, once you get there, uh, it can be you can really have some good long-term impacts for sure. Climate is fundamentally a materials and a hardware issue, and there are definitely a lot of investors out there that are focused on these sort of infrastructural problems. Um, so that's generally my take on hardware versus software, but it is important to be able to show those scientific milestones in order to get to the next check and the next stage.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's kind of like it sounds like the form of traction instead of a software company there being traction and product market fit demonstrability, you achieve a certain kind of scientific milestone which demonstrates that you're moving towards commercialization, right? So I would assume, and maybe you have experiences with this or not. I'll let you chip in if you think so, if there's something that pops out, but if you were building a company like this and you're going to a VC that primarily either maybe they say they invest in hardware, but it's made up of principals or GPs who only know software, they're probably going to be like, this makes no sense. We can't invest in this, right? Have you had
Yeah,
experiences with that?
definitely, definitely. I found that Khepra really has to find a niche investor, and kind of the sweet spot is an investor who's actually been a farmer before, who's working in deep tech and ag tech. Uh, but yeah, we've gotten that feedback before where they were like, we don't know how to diligence this technology. We're sorry, and we don't know how to help you either. Early stage investors, God bless them, they really do want to provide a lot of hands-on value. And so if they don't know how to help you, then they aren't going to want to invest.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's kind of interesting because there seems to be in a lot of circumstances misalignment between the people trying to raise money and the people with the money. And
Mhm.
it appears on the surface that there's alignment because the verbiage used is usually, hey, like we invest in technology. They usually include in their bio like, hey, we'll invest in hardware, right? But I think the reality comes down to they may not have the right people on their team to do that in some circumstances. So there's some difficulties that happen there.
Definitely, definitely. And sometimes you look at their portfolio on their website, and it's like 50% software companies as well.
Yeah,
Or you'll
exactly.
look and they say we do clean tech, but then they primarily invest in like smart cities, which is not a very good alignment. Even if they do invest in hardware, it's not good for somebody who's more focused on chemicals or ag tech.
Yeah, yeah, understood. Yeah. One question I had though is along the way with all those investments, is that just to clarify, was that all equity investment, right? That wasn't any kind of debt or any other type of investment?
Yeah, that was all equity investment
Okay,
from
interesting.
VC.
So, and then from this would be helpful. I'm really unfamiliar with this. So, I'm assuming the valuation process, right? Because you have to have a certain valuation to make sure you're not destroying your cap table as you raise money. Um, is it just that the people you've worked with who raised or who wrote you checks happen to, because you chose wisely, they happen to understand the industry, so they know how to value your business properly, and then as a result, you can continue to raise money in the future versus having very little runway.
Yes, yeah. It is funny, kind of going back to the software versus hardware investors. I've showed my round and my terms to software investors, and they're like, "Oh, pre-revenue, that valuation's crazy high." And then you go to somebody who's a bit more in touch with the hardware and chemicals industry, and they're like, "Oh yeah, this is normal." Um, so yeah, that is a key part in raising money at this stage, is finding alignment with investors who can really click with your understanding.
Yeah,
Oh,
that is interesting. I think finding alignment is really important. It's something that's come up almost every podcast with people who've raised money. So that's fascinating to hear. Um, I wanted to ask one other question around funding and timing. So, in terms of the time to reach profitability, right? There's usually an expected time horizon for software companies, for example, to find an exit. Um, can you speak to, if you're able to or understand it already, what is the usual expected kind of time horizon to go from a chemical, like you're kind of figuring out a technology. You mentioned you have to go through regulatory approvals. So there's going to be some understanding that, hey, this is going to take some time. What is that timing usually in your circumstances of what you're building?
yeah, a clean tech, chemicals, deep tech investor expects you to be like fully engaged in your startup for at least 10 years. A lot of the time, they're hoping for a liquidity event by around year 8. And really, it is important. There's an understanding that when you first enter the market, you might be break even on your product and your economics, and you have to do some cost analysis and reduce your costs in order to achieve profitability. Um, and and there's also understanding that hardware scales linearly since you physically have to build objects. Um, and so really what they're looking for is two things. One is climate impact. A lot of investors have targets for their fund, and you have to be able to demonstrate how much essentially GHG emissions you can remove or offset using a novel technology. And then the other thing that they look for is big markets. So it's useful to find a beachhead market that's a bit smaller and attainable in order to become profitable and become to commercialize, but you almost certainly have to have some sort of path towards, a $100 billion market, something like that.
Hmm. Okay. Definitely got to write that one down. That's very helpful. That's very helpful information, I think. I guess so. From there, I'd like to. Where should I move from here? Um, I think it would be keen to understand I guess your biggest struggles in this process, whether that is more like a personal thing on how to deal with pushing yourself to get to the next level with the business, and maybe making certain sacrifices. Like what has been your biggest challenge throughout this journey of building the company?
That is a great question. Um, yeah, it's really easy to get down on yourself when you're out there raising money. To be totally honest, I have been there have been periods of my life where I've been super nihilistic and I've completely demonized VCs and I've been like, ah, they're assholes, blah. Which probably shouldn't say that publicly, but they're just doing their job. It's their job to find, they get inundated with funding opportunities and they have to be able to really, really drill down into, what is the value of this technology? What is the scalability? how much capital is it going to take to be able to have this technology even make a difference in the world. So it is a mental game, and you have to really sometimes sit and do the work and recognize, like, hey, maybe the world is not out to get you. Yes, life is unfair, but you have to be able to spin it positively and focus on the ways that you can refine yourself and change the way that you do things, the simple improvements in life that you know even improve your attitude. Walking into any sort of meeting, whether it's a customer or an investor, or if you're looking to bring somebody on to the team and you're carrying this really negative self-perception, or a sense of defeat, or frustration, then people can smell it on you. And like that's a really big part of being a founder is like you have to be the spirit of the team and the spirit of the company. And sometimes that takes taking a break, that takes making sure that you get outside and breathe fresh air and can meditate on things and let things go. It takes kind of being at odds with your ego and like understanding that people out there are just doing their job just like you're doing your job. And yeah, there has to be an acceptance of like, this is the way the world works, and this is the way that I can change it. This is where I have my sort of my you have to have an internal locus for control, where you have to understand, like, these are the things I'm in control of, and this is what I can do to keep advancing and advancing and advancing.
Wow, that's awesome. I really appreciate you sharing that. I think that's very helpful, hopefully for a lot of people to hear. I think even for myself, not building a startup or anything, but it's so easy to um running a team to sometimes be just like bogged down by the stress, and you don't realize it usually in the moment, except for maybe a couple instances where you're like, oh wow, I should maybe chill out on that. But it really does affect your team. So I guess I'm kind of curious to hear, maybe if you could share a few more experiences around how to rally the team, right? If it's your role to kind of be the spirit of the team, to give the motivational speeches, to be the brave heart of the scenario. Um, what are some experiences of how things that you learned there, or things that you especially want to share with other founders going through that process of building the company, especially in a situation where, hey, listen, this is not just about product market fit. We have to, it's more of a science problem, for example.
Yeah, I will say that speeches are great, and when you're at your best, then that's always fantastic and always inspiring. But the hard part is generally, yeah, when you're at your worst, maybe you said something or did something that made rub somebody in your team the wrong way. And if you don't go back and heal that relationship, then that builds friction and it snowballs. And so a really, really key part of being a founder is also being able to listen with big wide open ears to what your team has to say about you, even if it's negative, even if you made a mistake, and being able to internalize that and say, like, I hear you, and mean it. Being performative about listening to people and then going back to some like crungy habit, or you know um like not really hearing what other people's needs are, is I think a common mistake. I've definitely seen it amongst other founders, and I've watched, I've seen actual companies fall apart that way. And the only way to kind of move forward from that is to, yes, be a leader, but also be a team player and be very open to what other people on your team have to say.
Yeah, that's awesome. I appreciate that. I think it's something, being in talent as my day job. It's very interesting to see how you can have good momentum, especially in the early days of a startup, because usually you're surrounded by a couple people who have very, very similar ideas about what they want to achieve. It's kind of the quote unquote day ones. Everybody's there, they're building it, but something can happen along the way, and it can be very quickly the the motion and the momentum is still there, but somehow a U-turn is struck and and things start to fall apart. And that
Oh
really
yeah.
is, especially at an early stage, you need people to be really on board because of leveraging on people's networks. A lot of people at an early stage company don't have the money to pay for a recruiter or whatever to be involved with recruitment efforts. So you really need to be able to play off your network and build a reputation amongst people and a bunch amongst all of your networks on how great it is to work there and what's the vibes like, right? It sounds very silly to some people, maybe, but it's really, really true how important those things are and how quickly things can go south if one person becomes kind of that narcissist who you have
Yeah.
to tiptoe around, right? So I really appreciate you sharing that. I think that's really helpful. I guess we've talked about a lot of things. We're running out of time here, so what would you say, things to close off with? What are you looking forward to? Any calls to action for the audience? What do you see in the future here?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I would say that, say the last 8 months, even back through the pandemic, although we had some good times economically in between, it's been a weird time to start a company. But I think that there's definitely a light at the end of the tunnel. Inflation is sort of waning now. There's a lot fewer calls saying that, we're going into this horrible recession. And it's hard on startups to be in the early stages, particularly Series B is really tough, I've heard, for startups during recessions. So I would say to everybody who's listening and building companies, be hopeful. I think things are turning around. Um, and it's a really, really good time to be starting a climate company or working on a climate company. There's so many novel federal resources. Attitudes have changed even in the time that I've been working on Khepra. It's gone sort of from corporates, greenwashing, nobody really cares about sustainability, blah, blah, blah. But there's a huge zeitgeist shift going on right now, that I've noticed. And, I think the world is definitely ready for heavy hitting climate technologies.
Awesome. That's really great to hear. I really appreciate it. It's good to hear from the inside of what's going on there. Awesome. It's been really a pleasure to have you on, Julie. I really enjoyed this conversation. I think hopefully people find a lot of value out of this. Where should people follow you and kind of follow the journey?
Yeah, well, you can look me up on LinkedIn. It's You just Google Julie Kring in the search bar. I'm not very active on Twitter, but you can also look up www.khepra.io, Khepra. And there's a contact form there. And if you want to get in contact with me, definitely feel free, and I can, sign you up for newsletters, what have you. But yeah, very open to conversation with anybody and everybody. And I love being part of the community. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really honestly, being part of ClimateTech is pretty awesome. I knew nothing about the space. I was come from a place where nobody believes in climate change, to be honest with you, or at least a lot of people don't. So it was interesting kind of being an outsider, if you will, and becoming part of it. And it's been pretty open, right? People are pretty awesome here. So awesome, Julie. We'll see what you guys continue to do, and looking forward to seeing your continued success.
Awesome. Yeah. It's been great talking to you.